tend to say this a lot, but once again, we've got a topic today and a presenter today I'm really excited to hear about. Because we are touching on cybersecurity, a very big topic. People really want to know a lot about it. And we are specifically looking at how privacy legislation affects cybersecurity. What are the challenges? What is happening in the region? We are going to talk about POPIA, but they will also be touching on other elements such as GDPR or NDPR, the Nigerian standard. There are quite a few of these blooming up, so it's going to be a very, very interesting conversation. My name is James Francis. I will be your host today, and as I said, we are talking about whether South Africa is ready for POPIA and what are the security implications of privacy legislation. And in the presentation, I'm not going to give too much of a prelude, because today with us, we have a great guest. We have Anna College. She is the SVP of Content and Strategy and an evangelist at KnowBe4. If you go to her LinkedIn page, you'll also find she has been around this industry a lot. She has received awards and recognition for her expertise in this area. And then on top of that, KnowBe4 itself has released several very interesting reports, surveys on the African market. One of the newest being the What Keeps You at Night report. I have gone through it. It is very good. There's a lot of data from this report in Anna's presentation today. She's going to take us through some of the findings they have, also the revelations around what's happening in security and what we can do about it. And after her presentation, we will have a Q&A. So please start lining up your questions. You will see there is a chat section on the right-hand side. You can pop your questions in there, introduce yourself, chat to other people. We will also have interactive polls today, looking at different scenarios, getting a bit of feedback from you guys to find out where you are at and what your impression is of what's happening with privacy legislation and cybersecurity. So without further ado, let me hand over to Anna. Anna, thank you.
Thank you so much, James. And yeah, thanks everyone for taking the time. I know it's the end of the year and we're all probably quite, well, I am, looking forward to the break. And I appreciate you taking the time off and participating. And I look forward to the questions. So let me just move my slide. I'm going to jump over that. Thanks for the intro, James. The next, I think I have about 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about, in particular, two research reports that we've just recently conducted and published. One is one that covers not just South Africa, but a sort of a pan-African survey we did called What Keeps You Up at Night, with sort of African CISOs and risk managers and IT execs. And then a bit more deep dive into a survey we've conducted across about 175 security professionals, privacy professionals in South Africa around data protection, or the POPIA Act in particular. And then hopefully we also get to discuss a few sort of recommendations that come out of that and suggestions. Okay, so before we kick off, there should be a poll popping up on your side, and it's safe to click on it. The question is, how well do you think, how well prepared is your organization for POPIA compliance? And if you don't mind just responding to that. And I think what will be quite interesting is to see, because this was one of the questions we actually asked in the survey, to see how the peers that are currently in this webinar, how that correlates or compares against what the survey respondents shared in the research report. So I'm not sure if this is already in or if I can see it. Let me just go there. They're still coming in, but currently I'd say that the majority of you said somewhat, but should be more. So everyone is sort of on the journey, I guess, but like with everything, there's more work that can be done. 27% so far have said that we've just started. 12% said we are very well prepared, and 6% said not at all. So hopefully, some of the information that we shared today might be useful or helpful for at least the guys who are on the beginning of the journey, and maybe we also have an opportunity to get some input from the ladies and gentlemen who are already well prepared. Okay, let's move on. So my background is officially in information security or cybersecurity, and I have done a couple of years ago. I did do one of the privacy certifications, and I remember that the message was clearly security is not privacy. It's a very different realm. And we, obviously there's different objectives, and there are a lot of different concepts. However, there is an overlap. So in the data protection or privacy world, we use security to, in a South African context, to fulfill things like, security safeguards or protecting the personal information. So there is an overlap, and I think that's just from a context point of view. What we're going to talk about today is primarily around the security of the personal information, and not so much about a lot of the other concepts like consent and limitation, purpose, etc., which are sort of the big components of the privacy regulation. So just as a disclaimer, if you're looking for more insight in terms of a lot of the non-security related privacy concepts, then that is not the right webinar, and I don't want to waste your time. But if you're interested more on the security side and the actual safeguarding, then I think this might be quite interesting. Okay. So I actually went to our director of privacy and I asked him, I said, Lucia, how would you define in like non-legalese terms, what is data privacy really? And he said, well, it's the ability to collect and protect personal information and use it in an appropriate manner. And we do that through creating policies, procedures, controls, security awareness training, and others. But ultimately, if we get it right, then we're building trust both with our internal, sort of our employees, the staff, the suppliers, the partners, as well as our external customers. And I think this is a nice sort of, I guess, non-legally sum up. And he also said, well, if we get it wrong, then this might happen and you may end up in a movie. By the way, I don't know if all of the attendees have watched it, I highly recommend it, The Social Dilemma. My husband, who's not in the IT industry, he's in wine, but after watching that movie, he deleted his Facebook account. And I'm not advocating that we should all delete our social media accounts. I didn't, but it's definitely a wake-up call for people who are not in the industry to understand what's actually going on with personal information and how it's been traded as a commodity. Also, what is interesting is if you're not aware of that page called enforcementtracker.com, and they track the monthly penalties or fines that are sort of being issued to companies that are non-compliant with GDPR, and you can see a definite trend there with or upwards trend with more and more fines being issued. And it will be interesting to see how that once in July next year, when the regulator enforces the POPIA Act, how that will look like in South Africa. Okay, so we've conducted a survey across about 400 organizations throughout 18 African countries, roughly East Africa, Kenya, West Africa, Nigeria, and Southern Africa. And I'm going to share some of the results with you now. Just again, a disclaimer, I'm sorry, but there will be a lot of graphs. In fact, the whole presentation is just graphs, but I think it's a nice way to sort of summarize the data, and well, you'll see it now. So first up, the industries that participated, you can see the majority came from the finance and sort of tech industry, a bit of telco, and then a nice, I guess, mix of other industry were represented. Also, what was quite nice to see is that we had a nice mix of different sizes of organizations, from SMB to very large ones, as well as different sort of roles or stakeholders, from IT management to IT staff, etc., and some C-level as well. So one of the questions was, how mature do you rate your security strategy at the moment? And across the African respondents, 33% rated their security maturity quite high, meaning they have designed a well thought out plan, a layered security strategy that addresses risks adequately. And then 13% said, well, no, very reactive. We know we're close. And then the rest are sort of, well, we have done some stuff proactively, but more work needs to be done. The other question we asked was around how or where would you rate your security culture? And I think what is quite positive is that the majority rated themselves positive. So they, again, 34%, which correlates with the previous question, said, well, we're very mature, well established. We use metrics to measure the success and sort of the maturity of our security culture. And then 25% said, well, our employees have adopted good cybersecurity behavior. And the rest sort of not so much, they need more work. But while we talk about security culture, and just like there's a slight deviation that I'm going to do now, is to ask you again a little poll in terms of what do you think, or how would you define security culture? What is it? Is it compliance to security policies? Is it that everyone feels accountable for security? Is it the level of awareness? Is it the executive support for security, or embedding security into the organization? So again, that should pop up on your side. And it will be interesting to see what your thoughts are. So let's just give that a few minutes. Okay, great. So I can see them, the responses coming in. And so far it looks like, again, a nice mix. Sort of a third of you believe it's everyone's responsibility. The awareness is quite high, and then also embedding security into the organization. So what is quite interesting is if we look at security culture, and exactly what's happening now as well is Forrester conducted a survey also earlier this year, or around, well, earlier this year. It was published in August, I believe. And they asked about 1,100 security professionals about how do you define security culture? And they got 760 different responses back, roughly categorized in those 4 areas that I've also added in the poll. But what that shows us is that even amongst ourselves who are in security or in the compliance kind of sector, we don't have a unified, I suppose, definition of what security culture really means. Everybody has like an idea, and they sort of obviously all related, but it's not really defined, and it's very difficult to measure or improve if you don't define it. So if we look at the sociologists, and they are the ones who really able to define as well as measure sort of organizational cultures. And the way they define it is they say, well, the ideas, which is sort of the belief systems, the customs, which is the day-to-day behavior, and the social behavior, meaning the behavior that we display in a group setting, not at home, but in a group, that really defines an organizational culture. And if we apply that to security, then the same sort of concept can apply just in terms of how it impacts the security of the organization. And this company from Norway called Culture, they took that because it's still quite a sort of high-level definition, and they said, well, let's use scientific methods to really deep dive and measure the level of these norms and behaviors and customs. And they came up with 7 categories or dimensions that can be used to assess an organization's security culture. And those dimensions are attitudes, for example, that relates to, do people have a positive or negative attitude towards security? The behaviors obviously is what do they do on a day-to-day basis, like do they use strong passwords, for example, or not? Cognition refers to the level of awareness and how much understanding do they have in terms of security principles. Communication refers to how well or not well does the organization communicate security concepts. Compliance is all about your written policies and any written rules, and then the norms talk to anything that's not written, but yet those are still rules that people apply. And then responsibilities is how far do users feel themselves accountable or part of the bigger security team. So they defined these dimensions, and then this is allowing them to measure and sort of compare and baseline different organizations and their security culture. And what they've done is, and again, a disclaimer here that Currently, the African responses are mainly from South Africa and Kenya, and also predominantly from the financial services sector. So it's also interesting to see how that will compare next year when we have a wider sort of participation rate. But we're talking really about, I think we have about 7,000 participants from Africa and over 100,000 from the rest of the world. And if you look at the high performers in terms of security culture, it's no surprise banking, financial services sector are sort of in the top performing level. But still, if you really look at it, they're not excellent or good. They're just moderately good. So they are at the top, but they're not great. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in improving. And then what is quite concerning, I guess, especially if we think about where we see ourselves at the moment, is that the education sector scored so terribly bad across the world, by the way, not just in Africa. And then if you break it down into the different dimensions, so the unwritten rules, the stuff that people do daily, the legal profession, by the way, scored really badly in terms of the norms and education sector. And then attitude towards security, unfortunately, the government sector scored really badly. So the people that work there have, for some reason, a really bad attitude towards security. It could be that they just think it's the IT department's responsibility, like we don't care about this. Again, education sector scored badly in that. And then cognition, which refers to learning and understanding of security, and the education sector again scored the worst, which is a real pity, because if we think about that our educational institutions are places of learning, and if security is, at least from a, let's call it basic awareness level, this should no longer be a tech skill. It should really be a life skill. You know, like everyone should understand by now how to conduct themselves safely online. And if that is not being portrayed or shared amongst the educational institutions, where does that leave us in the next generation? So that's really something, I guess, just as a side, that we need to do more about. Okay, so let's go back to the survey, the What Keeps You Up at Night survey, and look at the African organizations and what they're worried about, what keeps them up at night. There's again 6 sort of areas that we asked the participants to respond to, ranging from cyber threats to compliance, their users, executive issues. And let's have a look. So cyber threats, what are African organizations most concerned about? In average, the ransomware kind of threat is right on top, followed by malware, and then sort of social engineering, phishing, spear phishing. Business email compromise comes fourth. And then if we look at, and the graph here, by the way, so the red is sort of really concerned, so it keeps me up at night. And then yellow and blue is very concerned to somewhat concerned, not too much. So if we compare South Africa to the rest of Africa, then in South Africa, and this could be that, this is just a theory, but potentially South African organizations are slightly more aware than the rest of Africa in terms of the threat of social engineering and the fact that often malware and ransomware is being sort of distributed through social engineering attacks. So phishing and spear phishing is right on top in terms of what South African organizations are worried about. And then ransomware comes at number 4. But if you look at closely, you see that half of the respondents, that's really bothering them. So it keeps them up at night. So I guess the message is ransomware is one of the biggest sort of threats that people are worried about. And then social engineering, malware, etc. Data breaches is sort of more lower down, which is also interesting comparatively. Then we looked at, okay, what are the compliance areas or regulations that keep you up at night? No surprise here, South Africa, nearly half of the respondents are worried about POPIA, and then that's closely followed by King 4. And then what I thought was quite interesting, but this could be again because quite a large component of the respondents came from the financial sector. PCI came third, and then ISO was pretty low down on the list. So I would have thought that more organizations would be on an ISO compliance journey and worry about that. Or perhaps it could mean that they've already done it, but I doubt that. But I just thought it was interesting that PCI and GDPR, SOX, etc., even NIST were regulations or frameworks that people are concerned about. And then if you compare Kenya and Nigeria in the same token, what was really interesting is that, and here we asked, about their local data protection regulations. And it's funny to see that the Kenyans are more concerned about the Nigerian data protection regulations than the Nigerians themselves. And the Nigerians, if you look at it, they are comparatively not at all concerned. Like only 24% of them were concerned about their data protection regulation. They are somewhat concerned about GDPR, and also is right on top, which is it's just interesting if you compare that to Kenya and South Africa. Another question that we asked, what security initiatives are you busy with and that keep you up at night or that you're concerned about? A lot of the South African respondents said, nearly half of them, well, security awareness training is something that you are concerned about, and then supply chain security, or the sort of third-party security. Privileged access management is also right on top there. Incident response, the cloud, multi-factor authentication, user phishing testing could be part of security awareness training. So it's interesting if you look at what other organizations are busy with and what they are concerned about. Insider threat detection is more lower down. If we again compare that to Kenya and Nigeria, then it's weird. Like Kenya and South Africa, it's very similar. But Nigeria is always we even thought we have the wrong data, but it is. We had over 100 respondents from Nigeria, over 100 from Kenya, and then nearly 300 from South Africa. But this is what the Nigerians came back with. Like they're really not at all concerned about security awareness training. If you look here, nor about supply chain security. The only thing that they seem to be really concerned about at the moment is rolling out multi-factor authentication, and yeah, even cloud, they're somewhat concerned. Incident response, they're somewhat concerned. So it's just interesting. Either they're so relaxed there, or which I doubt that they have all their ducks in a row. My theory, again, this is just a theory, is that the level of understanding is still relatively immature comparatively to some of the other South Africans and Kenyan organizations that took part in this. So we deal quite a bit with Nigeria, and there is a definite need to still do sort of like demand awareness generation. Like in South Africa, for example, a lot of the organizations we're dealing with are very well aware of the human factor issue and the social engineering problem, and that's not the case in Nigeria. Like we still have to explain what that actually is. In terms of the users in South Africa, a lot of, 60% are kept up at night because they're worried about their remote users. And then in terms of the majority of the people are worried about negligent insiders as well, and users sharing passwords. So that's also interesting, malicious insiders as well. So just in summary, like that little research report, the key findings. So only 33% of the respondents felt that they had a mature security strategy in place. More than 90% are worried about negligent users and remote workers. Phishing and ransomware is right on top in terms of the cyber threats. And then in terms of the initiatives that organizations are busy with or concerned about, security awareness training, supply chain management, and privileged access initiatives. Budget, or having adequate budget, is a real challenge. And then POPIA is the largest compliance concern currently in South Africa. Cool. So quite a lot of graphs, a lot of sort of insight in terms of the security. Let's now go into the actual POPIA and the privacy study that we did. And you'll see why I started off with the initial one, because it's sort of there's a security overlap, and also it kind of contextualized that POPIA is one of the compliance areas that companies are concerned about. Let's dive into this one in a bit more detail. again, like the profile of the respondents was quite sort of varied. We had different, roles participating, as well as representatives from different sizes of organizations, from SMEs to really large ones. And then again, the financial services industry and the tech or telecommunications were quite were sort of the most represented. And then also quite a bit from healthcare, transport, media, and then a couple of others. So, decision makers, are your decision makers familiar with POPIA? We asked that question. And if we look at the responses, then quite a large of the organizations participated and said, no, they agree that their decision makers are familiar with POPIA. 65% believe that, and then only 16% disagree. And then there's like about 20% that are sort of didn't have an opinion. So that is, in my view, that is quite positive, because it means that the majority of organizations have conducted some form of awareness level, at least amongst the decision makers. So management is very much aware of it. Also, the media, I guess, have done a great job in terms of reiterating that POPI is real, it's coming. So that's good news, I guess. Then we asked, are you prepared for a data breach? And 30% said, yeah, and this again correlates with what we heard earlier, that about 33% feel they had a mature security strategy in place. And again, in South Africa, 30% think they have a very mature incident response process in place. The majority, like 50%, nearly 50%, say, well, we've got something in place, but it needs more work. And then the rest are sort of, well, it's not good enough. They need, either they think it won't happen to us, so they have nothing in place. I think that's quite dangerous, or it's not good enough yet. Then we asked, do you have the relevant privacy skills and the training in place amongst your compliance teams, security teams, etc.? And again, 66% agree that they have done the appropriate training, and 18% disagree. There's always that 15% who couldn't quite make up their mind. They're like in the middle. Then we asked, how well prepared are you in terms of POPIA compliance overall? And that was that question we asked right in the beginning. And it's interesting to see how it correlates also to what you've shared. Like the majority say, well, we are somewhat prepared, but it should be more. And then 30% think, no, we're actually really well prepared. And the rest is sort of not at all prepared yet, or they've only just started. In terms of the top concerns, what are companies or South Africans worried about? Data breaches is obviously the number one, and then that comes with fines. The other thing that they're worried about is the complexity of the compliance itself, like the actual projects around getting this done, and not being able to do business as usual, or making business more difficult, which is really interesting if you look at it from a business point of view. And I can also attest to that. I have a husband who is in the direct marketing wine business, and they always complain about, how compliance or data protection is making some of the, I suppose, business processes more difficult, So that is kind of an attitude amongst the business people that, again, I think we as an industry have to help change, that we make it still easy enough to do business, but at the same time, it's a business benefit to show good compliance and protect the data adequately. Then we asked, okay, what are the elements, like the people that, or the organizations that have implemented privacy programs, what are the sort of like elements that they've put in place? And you can see that the majority of them, 67%, have started with educating their staff on the actual principles themselves, or the sort of what changes in their day-to-day work, like what do they need to understand in terms of data protection and how that applies to their business processes. They've also started with a data mapping, or sort of identifying their personal information assets. That's also a really important step. A lot of them have tightened the technical controls or sort of security safeguards. And then there's obviously a lot of updating that needs to happen in the contracts and application forms, legal documents, the privacy notices that have to go up on websites, in the actual agreements, etc. And yeah, privacy impact analysis, only 44% have done that, which is, it often gets, you know, if you do any sort of formal privacy training, then they always preach about, oh, you have to first do a privacy impact analysis first, and then you do all the other stuff. So it's interesting to see that hasn't been, I mean, 44% of the organizations have done it, but it's not on top. But I suppose you can start educating your staff and identifying assets before you do the full impact analysis. The other question was, like, have you classified your data according to risk? Again, the 30%, those are like the, you know, those early adopters, I suppose, or the guys and girls who have their ducks in a row. They said, yes, we fully completed this. And then another 30% said they've got some basic classification in place. And then the rest is sort of, well, we haven't yet, or we've only just started with this. And then I found that very interesting too, is we asked, what are the attack vectors that were used in past incidents affecting your personal information? And 45% said, well, we had no incidents, or I suppose this is either they didn't or they don't know they had in reality. So that's quite a large component. A proportion said, no, we didn't. And then the ones that had incidents, you can see here that a big majority has had a social engineering component to it. So phishing was used to attack the organization and then ultimately resulting in a data breach. Malicious websites have been used. Third parties were abused. Malicious software on USB sticks, external devices, and then they weren't sure, or others. So that's quite interesting. Again, also correlates with a lot of the reports out there that say that, in fact, I think the Verizon report from 2019, the data breach report, also says it's 30% in the cases. Phishing or social engineering was used as the primary attack vector. And then that's closely followed by, I think, credential theft as well as malicious software. Then we asked, you know, has the pandemic impacted your privacy program? Nearly half of the respondents said, no, not really. But the other half did say, yeah, we were affected by it. A, because the remote users pose more risk to the personal information. It's more difficult to, you know, enforce controls. You know, people use, I don't know, like their personal devices, or they share their computers at home. They may not be as aware there. It's difficult to centralize a lot of the controls. And then others also said, well, we had to reassign budgets, like 16% had to give away budget that was assigned to privacy to support more pressing tech rollouts like VPNs, etc. Another question that was asked is whether South African organizations are complying with GDPR, and 45% actually said yes, we do in full, and then another 40% said yeah, limited, like not completely, but to a certain extent. What is interesting is I heard Russell Nell, he did a webinar with us the other day, which will also be, once we release it, it will be very interesting for people that want to learn more about POPIA. And he mentioned that if you comply with, because there's obviously POPIA and GDPR. I mean, POPIA was based off the original EU or UK data protection standards. So it's very much aligned to the European sort of principles. And if you do comply with POPIA, then you should be 80% there in terms of your GDPR journey. However, there are obviously quite a few differences and more stringent requirements in GDPR. So if you do deal with, you know, personal information of European citizens, or in fact, it's not just European citizens, it's anyone who's residing in the EU, then it does make sense to look at the GDPR specific requirements. Then we asked, have you run a privacy awareness campaign yet? Again, I think it's quite positive to see that more than half of the respondents have done that, and the rest is sort of planning to do it, or they've just done it to select staff only. So I think that's a positive. And then if we talk about well, okay, what does that even mean? How do we do privacy awareness? Then the content that was being used is sort of around telling staff how to handle personal information in their daily lives, like how do their business processes change. Specifically, if you think about if you have a call center or a sales environment where they now have to collect information to ask for consent first and sort of do the right kind of, I suppose, business process changes. Tracking and reporting capabilities was like another area that we should train our staff about. Policy awareness, obviously, and then just a sort of generic introduction to POPIA and the why behind it. Like, I think I find that always important, is to tell people why we're doing it and that privacy is a human right and the benefits to it. I mentioned Russell just now, so if you haven't met him yet, I think he's currently at Alexander Forbes. He's the data protection officer there, and he has an extensive knowledge of POPIA and anything related to privacy. And I was lucky to have a conversation with him just the other day, and I'm just going to share some of the practical insights that he shared with me then. Because in terms of the survey, that was sort of it in terms of the research reports. But what is, I think, more interesting is to now get into, okay, great, what can we do, like practically, what are the sort of steps we should be doing on the privacy or compliance journey? And his sort of advice was, if you're just starting out with this, the first step to do, and he actually mentioned this analogy of a bus, like you need to have a bus driver to drive your bus. So the first thing you need to do is make somebody responsible for this project, like assign your data protection officer, and then that person, so whether, that person needs to drive the initiative. And it is, depending on the size of the organization, it could even be a team, and it probably is a full-time role, especially in the beginning. And then education, so really creating awareness amongst the staff. And then in the beginning, obviously, very important amongst the decision makers and executives. And then also get some external assistance. Like there's a lot of, there are consultants out there and firms that have the necessary experience that can help you through the process. And I think it's really worthwhile getting that external expertise in. They have templates, etc., to help you through that journey. Then I mentioned Licio, he's our data protection officer. I also picked his brain. What should companies do when they first start out on this journey? His sort of advice was, well, you need to know what you're wanting to protect before you define how you're going to protect it. So the first step that he advised companies should do is create the data mapping exercise, and then sort of understand, where that data sits and where it resides and the risks to it before you decide how to protect it. And that makes sense. And it's, by the way, this is not just something that needs to be done from a POPIA or privacy compliance point of view. It really is advocated by any other security framework as well. If you want to achieve ISO compliance or PCI compliance, whatever it might be, that this data mapping exercise is always the first step that needs to be done, followed by a risk assessment. And then he also mentioned, after you've done your data mapping and the auditing, which, by the way, is also a great opportunity to do education, because when you do your interviews and you sit down with the process owners, you can then advocate why you're running this privacy program and sort of the reasoning behind it. He then said, well, executive support, I suppose, that's with any project. Without them, it's not possible. And understanding the organization's risk tolerance and compliance requirements. It will be very different if you're in a financial institution or someone who's using personal information, like a direct marketer, etc., that's their core business, to a agricultural company, for example. Here's just a screenshot of one of Licio's data mapping, I suppose, diagrams. And basically the idea is really to sit down with the process owners, identify where does the information come in, where does it get processed, where does it get shared with or stored with, and then identify all the different locations where it is, and then ensuring that those are adequately protected. This is just, again, also from our internal privacy team. I asked them, okay, like Lisa, you have a whole team, that's cool. And he says, so what do you do every day? And he says, well, yeah, we create these privacy policies and then also we enforce them. We obviously track and sort of compliance with the various privacy laws, not just local laws, which again, if you're part of an international company, very important to be aware of, the other legislations or jurisdictions that you're dealing with. And then there are also agreements that have to be put in place, or data protection schedules that need to be added to the agreements with your customers as well as third parties and suppliers, and then doing lots of assessments and audits and implementing data loss prevention solutions. This is sort of what they do on a daily basis. Some helpful resources. This often comes up, people say, how do I comply with POPIA? Well, you can't technically comply with POPIA, but you can implement frameworks or align with frameworks that help. And ISO, I think, is a good one. They have an extension to the ISO 27000 standard series that's particularly focused on privacy. And then also NIST has a privacy framework that might be interesting to look at. And then just in general, like good resources to look at the IAPP, International Associations of Privacy Professionals. They've got these certifications, like the Certified Information Systems Privacy Professional, I think it is. And those courses and certifications are really worthwhile doing if you are a data protection officer, for example, or if somebody in your team is interested in getting into that. I did this myself a couple of years ago. It's really great. Like, you do a 3-day course, I think it is, and then you write your exam afterwards. It's not rocket science, but it really gives you a much better and deep insights into all the privacy concepts that there are to know and how to implement it. And that really takes me to the summary. So key takeaways. First step, assign the data protection officer. Conduct your privacy awareness and education, data mapping exercise, important. And then on the security side, start off with your strategy, get your executives to buy in and provide the necessary budget. I know, easier said than done, and implement a security culture. And all of these should, put you on a good sort of path to do the right thing and ultimately compliance, I guess. And that's really it in terms of the presentation. Again, thank you so much for your time. I know there were a lot of graphs in there, and I appreciate you taking the time and the patience. And if there are any questions, you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter. And I believe, James, there might be some questions from the audience. So I'm handing over back to you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anna. Like I said, a very interesting presentation, a lot of information and some big insight in there, and a lot of surprises, which I'll touch on in these questions. Just to the audience again, you can use the chat on the side to ask questions. I do see some people have raised their hand to speak, but we're not doing that facility here. So please use the Q&A. Let's get some questions going there, of which we have quite a few coming in as well. Now, both Chris Hadjiyanis and Candice Brown are asking around the same area, and it's just overlap between GDPR and the POPIA Act. Chris points out that if you're POPIA compliant, are you also GDPR compliant? What's the difference? And then Candice points out that since we lack sufficient guidance from the regulator at this point, a lot of companies are looking at GDPR to kind of frame this around. So it's a bit of a multifaceted question, but I suppose what it comes down to is, what are the differences between GDPR and POPIA, and can we use those to kind of get success out of this process? Or can we leverage one off the other?
Yeah, I think the answer is sort of yes, somewhat. So like I mentioned, I think in the talk, that if you trying to be 100% GDPR compliant or POPIA compliant, you would have met 80% of the other regulation. But there are slight differences. I mean, GDPR has things in it that we haven't even covered, like, for example, don't quote me on the legalese, but the fact that you can transport your data. So if you you cancel a subscription with a cloud service provider, for example, in the GDPR world, you have the right to then get access to that data and transfer it to your next service provider. And that is currently not a provision in POPIA, or not to that extent. It's data portability. I think that is the actual term. So there are some differences. Also, I think GDPR is a bit stricter in terms of the notification and like, of obtaining consent, etc., and notifying data subjects. So there are a few differences that they are not massive, but they are quite unique that we need to be aware of. Also, remember in POPIA or South Africa, we also include jurisdictions like companies as data subjects. So whereas in the GDPR, it's only the natural people, whereas we also include a jurisdictive person, which is a company in the scope. That's also actually quite a big difference. But yeah, if you do one or the other, you 80% there. There's just be aware of some of the intricacies.
And I find it interesting that it's not just POPI and not just GDPR. I mean, NDPR is one of the other ones coming up. And in your research, we can actually see there's a lot of interest, for example, from Kenya and South Africa towards NDPR. And you can see, especially in Kenya and Nigeria, though it's not a privacy law, SOX, for example, comes in. These can't purely be due diligence. It really speaks to me that there are strategic reasons, commercial reasons, let's call them market reasons, why companies would want to comply to these different laws, which then comes to the question of consolidating efforts. Now, you have spoken about overlaps there, but is there a logic in kind of looking for a consolidated foundation for a business strategically, and then building into the individual branches of these different things instead of having individual efforts on each? How would you approach that in terms of security?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of trends, and obviously there are also tools in place that can help with this, like GRC kind of tools that help with the audit efforts, where you answer your question, let's say for ISO once, and then it already automatically populates it for all your other, whether it's a PCI assessment, etc. Because often the questions are the same. And again, it's like that 80-20 principle. It is very similar, but slightly different. And I guess to answer your question in terms of is there one, I think you can't really say is there one, because it highly depends on your business. So if you do trade with consumer credit card information, unfortunately you have to apply PCI, and PCI again has some very specific requirements. It's also not as risk-based as ISO is, where you can make a lot more decisions depending on your risk appetite. With PCI, it's you're either pregnant or you're not, like you have to do it, checklist kind of scenario. But if you don't, if you're not in a financial services institution, you don't deal with credit card information, for example, then I'm also a bit biased because I used to do ISO quite a lot, but I would do the ISO 27000 standard or follow those principles, because they're quite pragmatic. They use that risk-based approach. You start off with your identifying your information assets. You try and identify the threats and the inherent sort of vulnerabilities or weaknesses and the risks to the business. And then you define what controls out of the checklist make sense in my environment. And that would, set you up for a great sort of security strategy. You can then build your information security management system or your overall sort of organization. And then all these other compliance frameworks, controls feed underneath it. That's how, but again, I'm biased. And I was surprised to see that not a lot actually in South Africa ticked ISO as like sort of they weren't concerned about it. Whether that means that they're not following it is probably a different question. But I thought we would see more ISO concerns on top and not right at the bottom. So that was a surprise for me, to be honest.
I suppose it also has to do with the size of the business. ISO 27000 often being either larger enterprises or guys who already invested in showing that. Now, maybe the big difference here is people have treated compliance as a little bit optional, but then you have something like POPI, and you have a very responsive customer who's saying, what are you doing with my data? and you can get fined. So you can kind of be ratted out by your own customers in a way. And maybe that's what elevated it. And we've got more questions from the audience, but I wanted to point for one of the questions we did prepare before, and this is, how would you start a privacy awareness campaign? And I think there's two dimensions to this, both internally, but to take earlier what you mentioned, the movie you pointed at, there is a lack of appreciation and perception amongst consumers about what data, private data is. And there is a danger of everything getting lumped on companies. Now they're responsible, and that's not a sustainable situation. So I get the feeling that you have to educate your customers as much as you educate your staff. Can you talk a bit about what kind of campaigns goes to kind of help educate both sides?
Yes. So if we start off with the internal, the internal users, and then being a privacy awareness campaign, or just like any other security awareness campaign, what I would do first is define your key learning objectives. So what is it that you want your audience to understand? And generally you can then already divvy it up into, well, there is my general, everybody from the secretary, receptionist to my FD, they need to have a basic understanding of what this law is all about, why we're doing it, the benefits to us, sort of very base level kind of, key learning outcomes. And then as you go into the different audience groups, you have to then make it more specific. So you will start off with like a generic one that's like something that everybody, and that could be a 2 minutes video or something that everyone needs to watch, or posters, etc. And then you go into your, like, let's say your call center environment, for example, your sales staff, your contracts department, and they will have to have more specific process-based training that really relates to their day-to-day work. Where do they need to be aware of? What questions do need to be asked? What type of appendixes need to go to the contracts, etc. And then on top of it, if you think of it as like a pyramid, so you have the base level awareness and a little bit more sort of job-based, process-based training, and then right on top you have proper education, and that will be your compliance team, your security team that should do some form of privacy certification, or at least educate themselves a bit more around the details of the requirements. And that's how I would split it up. So really awareness, training, and education. And what you mentioned, in terms of the external awareness, I totally agree. And I think there's a positive trend that we're seeing with at least in the financial services sector and the insurance companies, that they've all been asked, I don't know if it's driven by the Reserve Bank or where it is actually coming from, but there is a centralized institution that is driving all of them to do a security awareness training to their consumers, because probably a lot of it is so human-centric, and social engineers are attacking the end users, and we can't just sit back as an organization and say, well, it's your fault that you got compromised, or that your machine got compromised, or you fell for a fish. We didn't do anything wrong. So I think it's nice to see that there is a shift towards, hey, we actually do take responsibility, and we are educating the consumers, or the external customers, as well as our internal users, to make sure that they're aware of what not to fall for. And I'm sure all of you would have seen it if you log on to, it doesn't matter if you go to Old Mutual or whoever, Sanlam, they all now have their security awareness pages on their websites, and the banks have done it for many years, that you can't even get to your bank accounts unless you read the latest security awareness message. And it's also,
true, yeah.
Sorry, yeah. And
it's so true. The banks do it as well all the time. Whenever you log in, you get the screen now of a button, and you can't go anywhere until you read the details.
I know.
Thank you. And maybe on that topic, so just jumping on the questions here, Tyrone Grant asks that finding interesting or engaging programs for security awareness to train staff, it's always challenging, and he's wondering, are there any suggestions on where to find new content, or maybe some new strategies to deploy for your training?
Okay, again, I'm obviously a bit biased here representing KnowBe4. So that's what we do. We call ourselves the Netflix of security awareness training. And if you come and speak to us, like, we have over 1,000, I think 2,000 different security awareness content modules that range from more serious computer-based training to, funny story-based videos, and all sorts of different vehicles that one can use, because it's also, like you mentioned, it needs to be engaging, but engaging means one thing for one group and another thing for another group. So sometimes it's important to have the same key learning message but delivered in different vehicles to the audience. It's like your execs may not want to watch a Netflix type, engaging story, but the call center people might, or they appreciate a bit of a sense of humor. And then, although I don't want to discriminate, the accountants often have very good sense of humor, but but you might have different types of contents for different audiences to make it engaging.
Great, thank you. And I think that is a big challenge, educating users, getting them engaged. You didn't touch on it too much in the presentation, but there is obviously a requirement to protect against things like phishing and these kind of end-user attacks that are becoming more and more common out there. It also then tells me that when you're doing this kind of preparation around this kind of legislation, there's the strategic side of how it will affect the business. And I suppose that points to one of your earlier questions where people complained that it interrupts user web business. But then the other one is that security strategy having to come in as well. And now it starts feeling like a bit of a perfect storm. I can't really do business I used to before. I've got this grudge of compliance, and I've got to bring security in as well. I can see then why people just hide from this. Do you have some advice on how you can bring that security protection element into this conversation as well, without bogging it all down too much in terms of the conversation in the business?
I think that, and again, if you go to decision makers or execs, there's a few things. First, they don't have a lot of time and they're not really interested. But so you have to prepare your message with, best is to use stats and sort of figures that tell a message in one picture. And one way of doing that is, for example, again, I refer to that Forrester study where they did say that, I think it was 94% of the respondents said that having a positive security culture has a positive business impact. So it's no longer just, we then are compliant and it's like a must-have and a risk thing. No, it actually is a positive business benefit, like, for example, having higher customer trust, having better reputation. Obviously, there's the reduced risk, and there you just need to explain to the execs that nowadays it's no longer when we will get hacked. It's no longer if we get hacked. It's like when we get hacked, and to prepare for it. So there's that. I would start off with the business benefit, and then obviously bring in stats that showcase what's happening. I mean, you don't want to be in the news and every week there's another data breach article. So, and execs are aware also. I mean, of the media. Obviously, ITWeb's doing a great job. They also read the news. They know that this is happening. Combine the stats with the business benefits in that conversation.
That touches or alludes at least to, we can segue to a question from Sandra Williams, which asks, do you think the government will be able to execute on the management of POPIA Act? And I think I'd like to rephrase that in that, is this going to be a big stick? Often we treat regulations of, we're going to do them, but who really comes to check? And usually regulations, some of these things are voluntary, so people don't quite apply it. Do you think there will be serious action and consistent action once POPIA becomes live?
Look, I mean, it's difficult for me to comment on the government's capacity or ability, but what I have been told before is that it will probably be more of a self-regulation process that will happen. So it will be the consumers or the victims themselves that will then drive the results, or they will put the pressure on the regulator if nothing happens. So let's say, for example, if there was a data breach, then the people who, and they can then by law, sort of request access to their data, and they need to be notified. And they could, this is what some of the lawyers sort of foresee, is that there might be class action suits where people get together and then sue the organization. And generally, I mean, hopefully it's not going to we won't have too many cases like that. And also generally the regulators are not there to like penalize the companies, because at the end of the day, even with all these GDPR penalties, it's not about penalizing, it's about making sure that, you know, because data breaches will happen. It's about making sure that you weren't negligent. So if you have implemented a framework, if you can show that you have done your utmost best and you still happen to get breached, then there shouldn't be a penalty. It's only if they come and see, geez, like it was completely negligent and nothing has been done, that's when the fines apply. So I guess that's also, but again, you know, listening to other sort of privacy professionals, they do say rather earn the side of caution and make sure you put all your ducks in a row. But yeah, that is from a principle point of view, you know, yeah, long answer, I guess, to your question.
What they're driving at. And I think what I also said earlier is we're dealing with a customer commodity here. So there's a lot more impetus from the market to respond to this. We're over time, but I want to ask one last question, and from Ibrahim Peters. If an organization makes the use of third parties, what is their responsibility to manage POPIA compliance in terms of an IT service provider? And I suppose that's that question of who's responsible where in terms of your security. I know the short answer is it's always going to be the company whose data it got stolen from, but I suppose, is there any mitigation? Is there any way to pass this back along to whoever supplied it to you? The compliance service?
No, unfortunately, there isn't. Like, and that's again so you talk about the responsible party, and that is really whoever. If you the contracting like the primary contractor, you're responsible for it, even if you use other data processors or third parties, and if they mess up, you are still the one who's responsible. So that is why it's interesting to see also in the research study, sort of supply chain management and third party sort of list of concerns, because you do actually have to be concerned about the level of security amongst your third parties. And that, again, if you think about it from a business self-regulating benefit, is actually a good thing, because it's a little bit like with BE compliance, you know, like you have to make sure that your suppliers do the right thing in order for yourself to not be negligent or, you know, be compliant, and that will drive the whole ecosystem as well to a better state.
And it's also something that's part of King 4, even though that's voluntary. This idea of your governance does not just stop at your perimeter, and I think that's the message that's coming through of this privacy regulation and why these have been so successful. POPIA, GDPR, a good example. I have never seen the market jump as much around a piece of legislation as GDPR, because I think people could see the stakes were much higher. And even the interest today on today's webinar shows people really want to know about this. And I think they are appreciating the overlaps that are between security, strategy, performance, data privacy, and being prepared for the future on that. So, Anna, thank you very much for your time today. That was a great presentation, a lot of great information. I do recommend the audience go find KnowBe4's What Keeps You Awake at Night report. It's very good reading. Lots of graphs again, but I like graphs, you know. It's much easier to see just what's going on there, get a feel for it. Lots of surprises in there. A lot more to explore. Hopefully one day we'll be able to dig in this a lot more. But for now, we are over time. So thank you very much for joining us. Our guest today was Anna College. She is the SVP of Content Strategy, and she's the evangelist at KnowBe4 Africa. They manage security training. As she's shown, they both have and know great experts on this topic. Find her on LinkedIn or Twitter, or contact her through KnowBe4's website and find out more about this. POPIA is literally around the corner. And this is just the beginning. We're only starting to really understand what personal data is, what needs to comply. And here's something to think about. The politicians and the bureaucrats are always behind step of what's going on in terms of technology and possibility. Public perception is also further behind that. But unfortunately, the blame is always going to fall on the companies involved. It's just the responsibility of doing business, so we need to be aware of these things. So thank you for today's presentation. The audience says it has been very insightful. They are very happy with it as well. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, Anna. Thank you to everybody who joined, and please have a great day.
Thanks. You too, James. Thanks for the opportunity and all the time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.